Scientists say this body of water, the lowest point on Earth, is now diminishing with such speed, losing nearly 1.5 meters every year in depth.
Archaeologists sift through caves looking for signs of ancient life, which led the Israel Antiquities Authority to intensify their operations in the Judean desert. A 10,000-year-old basket thought to be the oldest ever found.
A basket woven from rushes, fitted with a lid, sealed carefully, deliberately, by hands that are now 10,500 years of dust. That's what they found inside a cave overlooking the Dead Sea. Not a scroll, not a pottery shard, a basket, intact. The oldest intact woven basket ever found anywhere on Earth. And when the archaeologists lifted the lid, holding their breath, hands shaking slightly, they found a small amount of sand. Whatever had been inside was gone. Whoever had sealed it never came back. That cave had been sitting there for more than a century of modern archaeology, surveyed, noted, passed over. And it turned out to be holding a human moment so old it predates farming, predates cities, predates the alphabet by 7,000 years. Now the Dead Sea, the lowest body of water on Earth, has dropped to the lowest point ever recorded, 439 meters below sea level, and still falling. More than 1 meter a year, every year for decades. And as the water retreats, the cliff faces that line its shores are being uncovered. Cave mouths that were sealed by sediment, or hidden behind rock, or simply too low to access without risking the water, are now open. The Dead Sea is dying, and in dying, it is giving something back. What's inside those newly exposed openings is not yet fully known, but based on everything archaeologists have already found in the caves of this region, the answer could be stranger and older than anything the scrolls ever told us. The first thing you notice, standing at the Dead Sea shoreline today, is what isn't there. The water is further away than it should be. You walk across a flat, cracked plain of white. It looks like dried clay, but crunches like glass under your boots. And the sea keeps not arriving. The air is thick with salt and something metallic, like the smell before a storm that never comes. The cliffs rise behind you, 200 feet of pale limestone carved by millions of years of geology. And in the face of those cliffs, you can see them. Dark mouths, openings, some barely wide enough to enter sideways, others large enough to park a small truck inside. Many of them have never been properly excavated. Some have never been entered at all. The Dead Sea sits in the Jordan Rift Valley, a crack in the Earth's crust running between the African and Arabian tectonic plates. It is not just the lowest place on the surface of the land. It is, in geological terms, one of the most ancient inhabited landscapes on Earth. People have been coming here for at least 10,000 years, possibly longer. The cliffs are full of evidence of that, and the cliffs are still giving it up. For 7 years, teams of archaeologists have been systematically rappelling down those limestone faces, entering caves that had been identified decades ago but never fully excavated. The original surveyors in the 1950s had moved fast. They were looking for scrolls. If a cave had scrolls, they took them. If it didn't, they moved on. They left behind the pottery, the tools, the organic material, the layered sediment that tells a more complicated story. The teams that came after them understood. The caves were never excavated. They were looted by scholars and thieves alike in a rush that missed almost everything important. By the time the systematic survey began, over 600 caves had been mapped along the western shore. Drone technology was used to identify which openings showed potential. Archaeologists then rappelled down the cliff faces, sometimes 80 meters, and began the slow, painstaking work of sifting through what the first generation had left behind. What they found rewrote the timeline of the region. In one cave, scroll fragments. In another, a perfectly mummified child, 6 to 9 years old, buried in fetal position, wrapped in cloth around the head and chest. 6,000 years old, no name, no record, just the deliberate, gentle act of burial, preserved in one of the driest places on Earth. Somewhere in another section of the same cliff system, the basket, 10,500 years old, the lid placed on top, sand inside, whatever it once contained gone. The investigators paused when they got the carbon dating results back. Some of them sat with the numbers for a while before saying them out loud. The caves of the Dead Sea weren't just a hiding place for scrolls written 2,000 years ago. They were a continuous human record going back to the dawn of organized human life. And the record wasn't finished. The Dead Sea has been declining for over 60 years. That fact is not new. What is new is the pace. In 1970, the surface of the Dead Sea sat about 395 meters below sea level. By 2025, it had reached 439 meters below sea level, a drop of more than 44 meters in half a century. The rate has not slowed, and it is accelerating. More than a meter a year is now the baseline. Scientists who study the lake say it will keep falling for at least another century regardless of any intervention. When water retreats at that rate, it doesn't leave a clean edge, it leaves a battlefield. Along the northern shore, where the Ein Gedi resort once attracted international tourists floating effortlessly in the buoyant, salt-thick water, the beach has been closed for 5 years. Not because of pollution, because the ground is gone. Over 6,000 sinkholes have appeared along the Dead Sea coastline. Pits where the receding salt water left underground salt deposits behind, and then fresh water seeped in and dissolved them. And then the earth above simply collapsed, without warning, without pattern. The parking lot at Ein Gedi didn't drain or erode. It fell. Found a section of the main highway running alongside the Dead Sea didn't crack. It dropped. Abandoned beach chairs sit in the cracked sand at Ein Gedi. A lifeguard station, rusted through, leans at an angle over nothing. Date palm plantations have been left to die because the farmers cannot walk through the fields without risking the ground opening beneath them. One hydrologist described the shoreline simply as a place that no longer obeys the rules. The sinkholes keep appearing, the land keeps rearranging itself, and up in the cliffs above it all, the erosion and the shifting are doing something else. They are opening doors. A researcher who spent 3 winters excavating the Qumran cave complex described what happens to a cliff face when the geology beneath it shifts. Small openings that were sealed by compacted sediment get cracked free. Yet cave mouths just at or below the old shoreline are now elevated, accessible from the exposed lake bed below. Sections of cliff that were never reachable without a boat are now reachable on foot. The scientists who study the lake's decline call it a catastrophe. The archaeologists who work the cliffs call it an opportunity they didn't ask for and can't afford to miss. There's no easy way to say this. The dying of one of the world's most sacred landscapes is accidentally creating the conditions for one of its greatest discoveries. The Dead Sea Scrolls are extraordinary. No one disputes that. Written mostly between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, roughly 2,000 years ago, they are the oldest surviving copies of the Hebrew Bible. They rewrote what scholars understood about early Judaism and the roots of Christianity. They gave us texts that had been considered lost. They told us what people in this desert were reading, writing, and debating in the centuries before the birth of a religion that would eventually shape half the world. But here is the thing, the scrolls don't tell you. The caves that held them were not built for the scrolls. Every cave that has been properly excavated in the Qumran system shows evidence of occupation that predates the scroll period by thousands of years. Flint blades, arrowheads made from materials sourced over 50 kilometers away, a carved carnelian seal, obsidian, volcanic glass that had no business being in the Judean desert, traced back to deposits in Turkey, thousands of miles north. People were using these caves long before the Essenes, long before the Hasmoneans, long before the temple in Jerusalem was built the first time. One cave specifically, documented in published archaeological research, shows continuous human occupation stretching from the pre-pottery Neolithic period through the Chalcolithic period. That is a span covering most of the first half of the Holocene epoch. Roughly speaking, these caves were in use from the time when human beings were first learning to make fired pottery all the way to the beginning of recorded history. Whoever came to the Dead Sea Cliffs in those millennia was not a passing shepherd. They were returning, season after season, leaving layers of tools and animals' bones and ash. If asked, most of the research teams working the caves today will tell you the same thing. They found so much older material buried beneath the scroll-era deposits that the scroll story, the story that launched 1,000 documentaries, is in some ways the most recent chapter of a far stranger book. An AI dating model released in June 2025, built by combining handwriting analysis with radiocarbon testing on 30 scroll samples, pushed the oldest known scrolls back further than anyone had previously confirmed. Some fragments, researchers determined, dated to the late 4th century BCE, 100 years older than the previous consensus. Some, it turned out, were written in the very decades that scholars had long believed the texts were originally composed, meaning the copies we have are not copies at all. They may be originals. The study's lead researcher put it carefully, We have opened a new door into the ancient world, like a time machine, a door into the ancient world, in a cliff face full of doors. And the water is still dropping. If you're finding this fascinating, like genuinely helps this channel keep investigating stories like this one. When the team entered the Murabaat cave system, they weren't expecting to find something older than farming. The cave sits in the Nahal Haver area, south of Qumran, accessible only by rappelling down a cliff face in the dark because the sun sets on the wrong side of the mountain. The archaeologists had entered the cave looking for scroll fragments, possibly Bar Kokhba era materials from the 2nd century CE. They found those too. But when they worked their way deeper into the system, past the deposits from the Roman period, past the layers from the Hasmonean period, past everything they had come to expect, they found a chamber that nobody had touched. Inside, a basket, large, woven from plant fibers with a technique that no longer exists, fitted with a lid, fully intact. They didn't understand immediately. The cave had appeared empty, and then they were looking at it, whole, sealed, still holding its shape after 10.5 millennia in one of the driest environments on Earth. They removed the lid. Inside, a small amount of sand. Whatever had been carried in that basket, food, tools, something ceremonial, something practical, had long since dissolved. The moment of its sealing was gone. What remained was only the container, and the fact that someone had carried it in. Carbon dating gave them a number, approximately 10,500 years old. The basket predates the invention of pottery. It predates by several thousand years the earliest evidence of writing anywhere on Earth. It was woven roughly 5,000 years before the earliest human civilization that school children are taught by name. And it was found in the same cliff system that would, thousands of years later, hide the most important biblical documents in human history. One floor lower in the same cave complex, literally buried beneath a different stratum of human time, the team found the child, 6,000 years old, buried in fetal position, wrapped in a cloth around the head and chest, but not the feet. The cloth had survived. The CT scan showed it had been placed deliberately, carefully, in a shallow pit beneath the 2 flat stones. Someone had grieved here. Someone had carried a child, possibly theirs, were into the dark of a cave above the Dead Sea and done the best thing they could think to do with the unbearable weight of loss. The scrolls were hidden in these caves by people fleeing Roman soldiers. That child was buried here by someone fleeing something too. Or maybe not fleeing anything, maybe simply living? Maybe the cave was home. Maybe the Dead Sea in 4000 BCE was a different kind of place. The water would have been different then, the shoreline different. The cliffs would have looked out over a landscape that bore no resemblance to the one we know now. The data doesn't care about our comfort. These caves were not archaeological sites. They were places where people lived out the full span of human experience for 10,000 years before the first scroll was ever unrolled, and the water dropping is revealing more of them. Here is the honest version of the skeptic's argument, and it deserves to be heard. The connection between the receding Dead Sea and any specific new cave discovery is not a single, clean news story. There is no press conference, no announcement, no archaeologist standing at a podium with a placard reading "Newly exposed cave confirmed." What exists is a pattern, a shoreline in rapid and accelerating retreat, a cliff system known to contain caves at multiple elevations, including some at or near the former waterline, and a systematic survey that has already found 20 caves with significant potential that have not yet been fully excavated. Yet the skeptic will correctly point out that the survey team hasn't published a headline specifically linking the water's record low to a specific new opening. That's fair. That's accurate. What the skeptic cannot as easily explain is this. The survey's own methodology acknowledges that caves below the old survey line, caves that were simply not reachable during the original 1950s excavations, are now accessible. The investigators who work the cliff system describe plainly that the shifting geology created by the sinkhole process is actively changing which openings can be entered. And the record they've already built inside the known caves, Neolithic deposits, Chalcolithic artifacts, materials dating to the pre-pottery Neolithic, makes the question of what sits in the newly accessible sections not speculative, but logical. Every cave that has been properly excavated in this system contains layers that predate the scroll period by thousands of years. There is no reason to expect the pattern to break. The real question isn't whether something older than the scrolls has been exposed. Based on everything the survey has already documented, it almost certainly has. The real question is whether anyone will get to it before the geology And the looters, the lead of the Israel Antiquities Authority's anti-theft unit, said it plainly: "We are in a race against time. Finds of huge importance are still waiting to be discovered." He said it the year the survey began. He would say it again now. The water is lower. The cliff face is wider. The race is the same. Step back for a moment from the archaeology. Yet the Dead Sea is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, one of the major prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible. The prophet describes a vision in which fresh water flows from the temple in Jerusalem east toward the Dead Sea, and the sea is, the text says this explicitly, healed. The water becomes fresh. Living things return to it. Fishermen spread their nets along shores that are, in the prophecy's original world, lifeless. The prophet names the specific boundaries where this transformation occurs. For 2,500 years, that passage has been read as eschatology, as end times prophecy about a future restoration. Some scholars read it as metaphor, others as literal prediction. The argument has gone on in seminaries and universities without interruption. Well, what no one in those debates could have anticipated is that the Dead Sea would spend the last 60 years dying in a way that matches, uncannily, the inverse of the prophecy's logic. The shoreline that Ezekiel's vision heals is now being abandoned by the water at a rate that makes any restoration seem scientifically impossible within a human-scale time frame. The fishermen cannot spread nets on shores that are sinking into sinkholes. The salt that once supported the water's density is now dissolving underground and pulling the earth down with it. If we follow the evidence here, not as theology, but as pattern, the dissolution of the Dead Sea landscape is simultaneously revealing the oldest continuous human record ever documented in this specific region, and doing so in a way that appears, in hindsight, almost designed. Yet the water retreats, the cliff face extends. The caves that held the world's oldest basket, the oldest copies of the Bible, the bones of a child from the Copper Age, those caves are now surrounded by newly exposed rock that no modern human has ever examined. One controversial interpretation among certain researchers holds that the cave system was considered sacred long before any religious text designated it as such. The evidence for this is indirect but not trivial. The Neolithic and Chalcolithic peoples who used these caves over thousands of years were not storing mundane objects here. They were bringing high-quality tools sourced from hundreds of miles away. They were burying their dead with deliberate, tender care. They were leaving sealed containers in the dark. These are not the behaviors of people using a convenient shelter. These are the behaviors of people treating a place as significant. If that interpretation holds, and it is speculation, though grounded in the material record, then what the receding Dead Sea is uncovering is not just an archaeological site. It is the outermost edges of a continuous human relationship with this specific landscape stretching back to the beginning of civilization itself. The scrolls were not the first sacred objects hidden here. They may simply have been the last. And there is one more thing worth noting. The AI dating model released in 2025 found that two specific scroll fragments from the books of Daniel and Ecclesiastes were written in the very years that scholars had previously believed those books were originally composed, not copied later. Written then. That means the copies we have from the Qumran caves could be the originals, the author's own hands. And if the cave system extends back another 8,000 years beyond that, if the newly exposed sections contain objects from periods we have barely named, the question is not just what was hidden here. The question is, who kept choosing this place across every era to put the things that mattered most? Of course, there are simpler explanations. Caves are dry. The Judean desert preserves organic material that would decay in a month anywhere else on Earth. People use dry, sheltered spaces when they need to store or protect something, and they have done so since before history had a name. The pattern doesn't require a sacred explanation. It may require only a practical one, but the practical explanation has to account for the basket you sealed, carried in, left for 10,500 years. Someone expected to come back. They never did. The surveys will continue. The 20 caves identified as having significant potential are still waiting. The quarter of the Judean desert cliff system that hasn't been surveyed yet is still there, unchanged by everything that has happened below it. The water will keep dropping. The cliff face will keep extending. New openings will become accessible, some for the first time in any human generation alive today. Some for the first time since the water rose to its previous level centuries or millennia ago. The archaeologists who work this system describe the pressure in terms that are hard to convey. Looters, who have plagued the region since the moment in 1947 that a Bedouin shepherd fell into a cave and found jars full of parchment, are watching the water too. They understand what it means when the shoreline retreats another few meters. They have been doing this for 70 years. They are patient. They are watching the same cliff face. And unlike the researchers, they don't need permits or funding cycles or peer review. They need a rope and a truck. The race is real. The stakes are not abstract. Think of the child in the Chalcolithic cave for a moment, 6,000 years old, buried in fetal position, cloth wrapped around the head and chest, 2 flat stones placed on top, a grave so small it could be missed by someone moving quickly through a chamber looking for parchment. That burial is not in any text. It is not referenced in any scroll. It predates the alphabet. It predates the faith traditions that made this specific stretch of desert one of the most contested landscapes on Earth. And yet it is there, preserved in the dark, above the dying sea, waiting alongside the basket, alongside the flint blades brought from hundreds of miles away, alongside the layers of ash from fires that nobody who is alive today can identify. Someone carried that child up the cliff face. Someone prepared a cloth. Someone placed the stones. And then they left. Or they didn't leave. Maybe they stayed until they couldn't. Maybe the cave is full of their story, and the story is still buried in sediment that no one has sifted yet. The Dead Sea is dropping at more than a meter per year. By the time any follow-up excavation is funded and launched, the shoreline will be different again. New sections of cliff will be accessible. Some of what is being exposed right now, today, is being exposed to the open air for the first time in recorded history. The water level of the Dead Sea, as of 2025, stands at 439 meters below sea level. That number will be higher, lower, in terms of the physical drop by the time you finish watching this. The lowest point on Earth keeps going lower, and along its cliff walls, in the dark of chambers that have held 10,000 years of human choices, something is waiting to be found. The newly accessible sections of the cliff face now fall under a disputed jurisdictional boundary. The retreating shoreline shifts territorial lines between Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority in ways that no treaty from the 1990s anticipated. Because no treaty anticipated the sea declining this fast. Who has authority over what the water reveals, as it reveals it, is genuinely unresolved. Whatever is in the newly opened caves belongs, legally, to a question that hasn't been answered yet, and the caves themselves are not waiting for the lawyers. Here is the question that the researchers won't answer on record, but that the evidence keeps pushing toward. The basket was sealed with a lid. The child was wrapped in cloth. The scrolls were placed in sealed clay jars. The copper scroll, one of the strangest documents ever found in the cave system, describes the locations of buried treasures in language so specific that it reads like a map, not a metaphor. 10,000 years of people choosing this cliff face. Saw 10,000 years of people hiding the things they could not afford to lose. Were they all doing the same thing? Preserving something for a future they couldn't see? Or were they doing something stranger, adding to a record that was already there when they arrived? A place where, for reasons that preceded every religion that would later claim it, human beings have always brought what matters most, sealed it in the dark, and trusted the desert to hold it. If this story changed how you see what's sitting in those cliffs, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And let me know in the comments. Do you think what's in those newly exposed caves is the physical record of a civilization we've barely started to understand? Or is something far stranger waiting in the dark at the lowest point on Earth?